Mom yells at daughter for playing with dirty kid. That kid secret shocks everyone. The summer sun in Cedarwood fell heavy on the sidewalks, the heat curling the edges of newspapers and leaving tiny ripples on the windshields of parked cars. On such afternoons, the neighborhood children found refuge in each other rather than in the air-conditioned silence of their homes. They ran barefoot, their laughter echoing down the narrow lanes, chalk drawings of hopscotch laid out like treasures on the concrete. Among them was Sarah, a 7-year-old with hair the color of corn silk. Freckles darted across her nose like faint constellations. She laughed loudly when chalk dust smeared her knees, and she clapped her small hands when someone made a daring hop into the square. Next to Sarah stood Jamal, a quiet boy, his spiral curls catching the sunlight, his shirt one size too big, and his sneakers scuffed from many hand-me-downs. To Sarah, he was more than a boy from down the street. He was her partner in every game, her co-architect in mud castles, her brave competitor in races across the cracked sidewalks. For Sarah, there was no distinction marked by color or class, just the immediacy of friendship. But outside the children's circle of innocence, walls of perception were rising. Those walls followed them into doorways, into the watchful eyes of parents, into subtle whispers exchanged between neighbors who didn't even mask their suspicion. On that afternoon, when Sarah held Jamal's hand, their laughter sharp as glass, a voice cut across the games like a whip. "Sarah." The voice belonged to Mrs. Thompson, her figure framed against the porch doorway, hands clutching the railing, as though holding herself back from descending with fury. Her voice hardened. "What did I tell you about playing with that boy?" The children froze. Jamal's eyes shifted toward the ground, the joy running from his face, replaced by a familiar shadow he understood far too well. Sarah looked back and forth between Jamal and her mother, confusion carving a small furrow in her innocent brow. "But, Mom, we're just playing," she began. "Playing?" Mrs. Thompson's voice rose, gathering judgment like storm clouds. "I've told you before, he's not the kind of child you should be around. Do you understand me? He's dirty. They're people." She hesitated, lowering her tone, but not enough to stop the venom from dripping into the hot air. "They don't belong here, Sarah. His kind will only drag you down." Gasps rippled through the children. Sarah's small hands trembled, not from guilt, but from the force of her mother's words slicing into the afternoon. Jamal turned, suppressing any rise in emotion, and prepared to leave quietly, as he had been taught. He was 7 years old, but already he knew that silence was sometimes safer than protest, that retreat was better than putting himself in front of more hate. "Wait!" Sarah cried, her voice fragile yet desperate, but Jamal's retreat quickened. His feet carried him toward his grandmother's small house at the corner of the block, an old wooden structure whose paint peeled like sunburnt skin. Sarah watched his back, her heart pounding with frustration she couldn't yet fully name. Inside the Thompson house, the confrontation continued. Mrs. Thompson lectured, her words sharp as needles, her tone heavy with the weight of prejudice learned long before her daughter was born. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, hands clenched into fists, anger flooding her eyes in a way her mother had never seen. "He's my friend," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "And he's not dirty." "Enough," Mrs. Thompson snapped, though inside, a faint wave of unease rose. Something in Sarah's quiet defiance unsettled her, not because the child was wrong, but because she herself had cracked under the honesty radiating from her daughter's simple truth. That evening, Sarah sat by the window, watching as Jamal and his grandmother sat on their porch. Sarah often saw them together, the grandmother watering her plants diligently, humming old hymns that carried both sorrow and hope in each note. Her garden was vibrant, flowering defiance against the cracked earth and hard gazes of neighborhood. Sarah pressed her face against the glass, making a silent vow. No words, no barriers, would stop her from standing beside her friend. The following day, Sarah went back outside. Jamal was reluctant, his steps hesitant, his eyes wary as if testing invisible boundaries. But Sarah ran toward him, beaming, carrying her chalk like an olive branch. Before Jamal could turn away, she grabbed his hand. "We're still friends," she said. "Nothing will change that." Something in her certainty struck Jamal. This girl who didn't share his struggles, who didn't live inside the same kind of fear, was extending something extraordinary to him: loyalty. At 7 years old, she gave him a gift many adults had failed to give: the unwavering belief that he was worthy of being loved and respected. But storms do not calm so quickly. Later that week, the children played again, laughter once more the soundtrack to their games, when Mrs. Thompson's disapproving presence returned. This time she wasn't alone. Standing with her was Mrs. Reynolds, another neighbor, notorious for passing judgment on anyone who fell outside her vision of respectability. Whispers turned to chuckles, chuckles to pointed remarks, remarks to rumors. That Thompson girl is out there holding hands with a Reynolds boy. Haven't they heard about his family? About his father? The neighborhood buzz grew heavier, and under it, Jamal's grandmother listened. She watched not with bitterness, but with calm resilience. She had lived through enough to recognize the cycle of hatred when it reared its head. Yet she also knew the world had a way of revealing truths when the time was right. Her grandson's dignity was not defined by those whispers, but she suspected the day would come when those same critics would learn the weight of their misjudgment. And that day came sooner than anyone expected. A week later, the town gathered for a community event at the local park, an annual fundraiser celebrating Cedarwood's history, its businesses, and its future. Families dressed in their neatest outfits, music floated on the breeze, and speeches filled the stage. And as fate would have it, Jamal's grandmother, quietly respected by a few though overlooked by many, had been invited to share some words about community, resilience, and hope. At first, attendants murmured with surprise. Why her? Why the grandmother of the dirty boy? But as she took the stage, her posture straight, her voice steady, a hush fell over the crowd. She spoke not of hatred, but the soil of Cedarwood, where generations of sweat, hope, and endurance had been poured. She spoke of raising children in a world that too often refused to see their worth. She spoke of dignity, of choosing compassion over cruelty, of reminding the young that every soul, regardless of skin, class, or history, carried the same sacred right to belong. And then she revealed something that silenced even the most cynical whispers. "My name is Evelyn Parker," she said, "and perhaps some of you do not remember, but 30 years ago, when Cedarwood was on the brink of economic collapse, I was one of the principal architects who petitioned the council, secured funding, and opened the very factory that employed hundreds of families here, including many of yours. I stayed quiet about it because I didn't need recognition. I wanted only to see everyone thrive. Some of you work jobs today because of that effort. Some of you send your children to school because of those paychecks. And yet, when you look at my grandson, you call him less than." A wave coursed through the audience, murmurs, gasps, then a deep, unenviable silence. Mrs. Thompson, standing stiff at the edge of the crowd, felt her chest tighten. Here, the child she had called dirty bore the legacy of a woman whose labor had carried much of the town. Sarah, standing between the children, felt pride swell within her. She turned to Jamal, eyes gleaming, whispering words that would echo through both their childhoods. "See? They were wrong. You are not less. You are more." Jamal's grandmother concluded her speech with words that lingered even as the music resumed, words that held gravity beyond her years. The measure of a community is not in how it treats the powerful, but in how it allows the smallest among us to grow. Look at my grandson and tell me, is he not every bit deserving of joy, respect, and future as your child? The air felt charged, a shift invisible yet undeniable. Some people shuffled awkwardly. Others wiped their eyes. And though prejudice dies hard, in that moment dignity forced its way onto the stage, leaving those who clung to bias with nowhere to hide. When the applause finally erupted, it came not all at once, but in hesitant waves. A handful of people clapped, then a few more, hesitant at first as though uncertain whether social permission had been granted, until finally the entire park buzzed with applause. Evelyn Parker bowed her head gracefully, thanked the audience, and stepped down. But to Mrs. Thompson, the sound of clapping hands was unbearable. Each cheer pressed against the shame rising in her chest. She had seen Evelyn every day in that peeling house at the corner, never once suspecting greatness lived behind its weathered walls. For months, she had dismissed Jamal as dirty, A boy unfit for her daughter's friendship, never realizing his family had woven their fingerprints into the very survival of Cedarwood. Now no excuse could soften the sting. Sarah pulled at her mother's hand, whispering, "See, Mom? Jamal's family helped the whole town. He's my best friend. Why can't you just see what I see?" The words were tender, but to Mrs. Thompson they felt like arrows. She turned away, muttering excuses about wanting to go home. But that night, when the quiet descended and the day weighed heavy on her, the truth gnawed at her conscience. Her prejudice had not only hurt a child, but also betrayed her daughter, teaching her cruelty instead of compassion. For the first time in years, Mrs. Thompson confronted herself in the mirror and disliked the reflection staring back. Meanwhile, Jamal's life seemed unchanged on the surface. He still helped his grandmother water the plants after school, still wore his scuffed sneakers, still carried himself with quiet humility. But inside, something had shifted. The speech had not only lifted him, it had awakened in him the realization that his worth was rooted in the strength of all who came before him. He no longer felt invisible. With Sarah's unwavering loyalty alongside his grandmother's revelation, he had proof that dignity could survive prejudice, and he promised himself he'd carry that truth proudly. The next morning, when Jamal walked to school, children whispered differently. Where before they had mimicked adults' cruel words, now they asked hesitant questions. Is it true your grandma saved the factory? Does that mean she's, like, a hero or something? Jamal shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention, but Sarah, never shy, answered for him. Yes. His grandma is amazing, and Jamal's amazing too. You should be proud if he talks to you. That day at recess, Jamal noticed something else. Children who had avoided him before now wanted him on their team. Not everyone, but enough to show that the weight of his grandmother's words had cracked something in the community's wall of prejudice. Yet Mrs. Thompson remained the last fortress of resistance. That evening, she pulled Sarah aside again. "Sweetheart," she said, her tone heavier now, "I just want the best for you. Sometimes friendships can make life harder." Sarah stared at her mother with a fire that belied her age. Or maybe it's not friendships that make life hard. Maybe it's people making rules about who we can and can't love. Jamal's my friend. You're the only one who makes that a problem. The bluntness cut deep. Mrs. Thompson had no reply. The words spiraled in her mind all night, mingling with visions of Evelyn Parker standing on stage, her voice calm, her pride unshaken. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between mother and daughter simmered. Sarah refused to bend, and Jamal tried to stay polite, though Mrs. Thompson's coldness never escaped his notice. One Saturday, the rift boiled over when Mrs. Thompson caught Sarah sneaking a bag of cookies out the door. "Where do you think you're going with those?" "They're for Jamal and his grandma," Sarah insisted. "They share with me all the time. Why can't we share too?" "Because—" Mrs. Thompson stopped mid-sentence, realizing every reason that had once easily flowed from her lips now seemed shallow. The truth, stripped of justification, was simply prejudice. She swallowed her words, feeling her authority crumbling in front of her daughter's persistence. With a sigh that carried both surrender and exhaustion, she let Sarah go, watching the child dart down the street with cookies swinging in her arms. And in that moment, watching her daughter's small act of generosity, Mrs. Thompson experienced something she hadn't felt in years. Humility. At Evelyn Parker's porch, Sarah was greeted not only with warmth, but with gratitude. Evelyn set the cookies on the table and looked deeply into Sarah's young, fearless eyes. "Child," Evelyn said softly, "you remind me of a promise, that tomorrow can look better than yesterday if enough of us choose courage over fear. The world isn't always kind, but you've already learned something most grown UPS have forgotten." Sarah beamed, though she didn't entirely grasp the full weight of Evelyn's words. To her, she was simply doing what any friend should do, standing up, delivering kindness, refusing to let cruelty dictate her choices. Yet Evelyn's eyes glistened with pride. She knew courage when she saw it, no matter the age. The real breaking point came 2 weeks later, during a church gathering. Cedarwood prided itself on Sunday services, where sermons were not just religious but deeply communal events. On this particular Sunday, the pastor, having witnessed the recent undercurrents, chose to speak about dignity. He preached, "You cannot claim righteousness on Sunday and belittle a neighbor on Monday. You cannot bring offerings to the altar, yet deny friendship and respect to God's children outside these walls. For it is written, the measure of our love is proven not with the strong or the wealthy, but with how we treat those we have deemed least among us." The words pierced Mrs. Thompson like arrows. It was as if the pastor had gazed directly into her heart. She glanced nervously around the pews. Fearful her guilt was written plainly on her face. Across the aisle, Sarah sat next to Jamal, giggling softly with him as they shared a hymnal. The sight should have softened her heart. Instead, shame washed over her, because she knew her daughter was closer to righteousness than she was. After service, while many lingered in polite conversation, Mrs. Thompson quietly approached Evelyn. The older woman, always poised, simply tilted her head slightly when she saw the approaching figure. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice barely audible. "For the things I said, for the things I thought. I was wrong. About Jamal. About you. About everything." Evelyn studied her. For years, she had swallowed condescension, lived with slights, ignored whispers. Yet in this small moment, she saw something shift. She didn't smile triumphantly nor gloat. Instead, she placed a hand gently on Mrs. Thompson's shoulder. "Change begins in the heart," she said. "And if your heart is changing, then let that be enough. Teach your daughter better than you were taught. That will matter more than any apology." Tears gathered in Mrs. Thompson's eyes. No sermon, no lecture could have matched the grace Evelyn extended in that quiet exchange. For the first time, Mrs. Thompson felt lighter, not because her wrongs were erased, but because she had finally faced them. From that Sunday onward, things began to shift. Slowly, awkwardly at first. Invitations extended. Conversations happened. Neighbors who had whispered cruelly about Jamal and his grandmother suddenly smiled when they passed. Even if the smiles wavered with guilt, Jamal noticed but said nothing. He had learned that time, not words, revealed sincerity. The truest change was in Mrs. Thompson herself. She didn't become perfect overnight, nor did years of learned prejudice evaporate at once. But she began making deliberate choices. Walking Sarah to the Parkers' home with fresh groceries, complimenting Jamal in public, even defending his dignity when others slipped into their old habits. The community noticed. More importantly, Sarah noticed. One night, as mother and daughter sat at the kitchen table, Sarah reached across and held her mother's hand. "See? It's better when you're kind. Don't you feel it?" Mrs. Thompson nodded silently, overcome. For all the lectures she had given her daughter, it was Sarah who had been the teacher all along.